The oldest surviving receipt in human history was not for gold, land, or livestock. It was for beer. More than 5,000 years ago, in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded daily beer rations distributed to laborers, priests, and royal officials. Workers who built temples were often paid not in coins, which had yet to be invented, but in carefully measured jars of brewed grain. Beer flowed through the economy as food, currency, medicine, and ritual all at once. Centuries later, pharaohs would stock vast breweries along the Nile to feed thousands of workers. Medieval monks would perfect brewing techniques behind monastery walls. Sailors would carry barrels of beer across dangerous oceans because they often remained safer to drink than stagnant water. Governments taxed it, kings regulated it, scientists studied it, and industrialists transformed it into one of the world's first mass-produced consumer goods. It is easy to dismiss beer as a simple beverage, something poured into a glass after work or shared during celebration. History tells a different story. Beer helped sustain the first cities. It encouraged agriculture, supported organized labor, financed states, accelerated scientific discovery, and traveled wherever civilizations expanded. Again and again, this humble drink became entangled with power, commerce, religion, and survival. It was never just beer. Behind every pint lies thousands of years of human ambition, innovation, and conflict. But that is not where this story begins. To understand how beer changed the world, we need to go back to a time before kingdoms, before writing, and perhaps even before civilization itself. Long before brewers measured ingredients with precision or fermentation was understood as science, people encountered beer by accident. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age faded, communities across the Fertile Crescent began abandoning nomadic life in favor of permanent settlements. Wild grasses, such as barley and einkorn wheat, became increasingly valuable. For the first time, people harvested grain not merely for immediate survival, but for storage. Stored grain changed everything. Unlike meat or gathered fruit, grain could last through difficult seasons. Yet storage also introduced something unexpected. When crushed grain mixed with water and naturally occurring wild yeast, fermentation began on its own. Sugars transformed into alcohol. What emerged was a cloudy, mildly intoxicating drink unlike anything humans had previously consumed. No one knows the exact moment beer was discovered. It likely happened many times in many places. A forgotten bowl of soaked grain, left untouched for several days, may have produced one of humanity's earliest fermented beverages. The taste would have been sour, earthy, and thick, closer to a nutritious porridge than the clear lagers familiar today. It was rich in calories, vitamins, and nutrients released during fermentation. In communities where food security was uncertain, every calorie mattered. Archaeological discoveries suggest fermented grain beverages appeared astonishingly early. Chemical residues discovered at prehistoric sites indicate that people were experimenting with fermentation thousands of years before written history. Similar evidence has emerged from regions stretching from the Near East to ancient China, where early communities fermented mixtures of rice, honey, and fruit as early as the 7th millennium BCE. Beer was not yet an industry. It was a discovery. As agriculture spread, brewing became increasingly reliable. The same fields that produced bread also supplied the ingredients for fermented drink. Grain harvests could now nourish people in multiple forms, extending both nutrition and social life. Many historians even propose that the desire to brew beer encouraged larger grain harvests and more permanent farming. While the exact relationship remains debated, agriculture and brewing clearly evolved together. One reinforced the other, creating a cycle that favored settled communities over wandering bands of hunter-gatherers. For perhaps the first time, fermentation offered something more than nourishment. It offered stability. That stability would become one of the foundations upon which civilization itself was built. By roughly 3,500 BCE, beer had become woven into the fabric of urban life in Mesopotamia, where the world's earliest cities rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, brewing transformed from household practice into organized production. The Sumerians cultivated barley on an enormous scale. Bakers produced loaves known today as beer bread, partially baked grain cakes designed specifically for brewing. These loaves were crumbled into large clay vessels, mixed with water, and left to ferment naturally. Dates, herbs, and other ingredients were sometimes added to enrich flavor or increase sugar content. The process demanded knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Brewers learned how temperature, grain quality, and timing influenced the final drink long before microbes were understood. Beer soon became inseparable from religion. One of the oldest surviving literary works devoted entirely to brewing is the hymn to Ninkasi, composed around 1800 BCE in honor of the Sumerian goddess of beer. The hymn functioned not only as a prayer, but also as a practical brewing guide, preserving techniques in poetic form. In a world where literacy remained rare, sacred verse became an instruction manual. Temples operated some of the largest breweries in the ancient world. Brewing supported priests, festivals, and charitable food distribution while strengthening the authority of religious institutions. Beer became both an offering to the gods and a necessity for ordinary life. Far to the southwest, ancient Egypt embraced brewing with equal enthusiasm. Workers constructing royal monuments, including the communities that supported the building of the pyramids, received daily allocations of bread and beer as part of their wages. The drinks supplied hydration, calories, and nutrients for physically demanding labor under the desert sun. Beer crossed every level of society. Farmers drank it after harvest. Children consumed weaker versions. Nobles enjoyed refined brews flavored with herbs and fruit. Physicians even prescribed beer as a base for medicinal remedies, blending it with plants believed to treat illness. As cities expanded, so did the need for consistency. Brewing encouraged standardized measurements, storage techniques, specialized occupations, and administrative record-keeping. Clay tablets documented ingredients, production, and distribution with remarkable precision. This was no longer an accidental fermentation in forgotten grain. It had become infrastructure. For one of the first times in history, an everyday food demanded organized agriculture, skilled labor, bureaucracy, and large-scale logistics working together. The same systems that kept breweries running also strengthened the administrative machinery of early states. Beer did not merely accompany civilization. It helped teach civilization how to organize itself. Civilizations rarely kept their greatest innovations to themselves. Beer was no exception. As kingdoms expanded and trade routes stretched farther across continents, brewing knowledge traveled with merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and migrants. Every journey carried more than grain or pottery. It carried recipes, techniques, and traditions that would reshape cultures thousands of miles away. In ancient Egypt, beer production reached an extraordinary scale. State-sponsored breweries supplied cities, temples, military expeditions, and construction projects. Large ceramic jars filled with beer moved along the Nile, one of history's greatest commercial highways. Grain from fertile floodplains became both sustenance and political power. Controlling beer meant controlling food, labor, and stability. The Greeks admired wine above all else, often viewing beer as the drink of foreign peoples. Yet as Greek merchants encountered Thracians, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians, they documented brewing practices that differed remarkably from their own. Beer survived cultural prejudice because it remained practical wherever grapes could not easily grow. The Romans inherited that attitude. Wine dominated Roman identity, but Rome's frontiers told another story. In the colder provinces of Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, barley thrived where vineyards struggled. Local brewing traditions persisted, and Roman soldiers stationed along distant borders often drank locally brewed alesh. Even the largest empire of antiquity adapted to geography. When the Western Roman Empire fragmented during the 5th century, brewing entered a new chapter. Across medieval Europe, monasteries became unlikely centers of technological innovation. Monks cultivated grain, copied manuscripts, experimented with recipes, and refined brewing techniques with remarkable discipline. Hospitality was considered a sacred duty, and travelers were frequently offered bread and beer upon arrival. Within monastery walls, brewing became both spiritual practice and economic enterprise. One innovation proved especially transformative: hops. Although various herbs had flavored beer for centuries, hops gradually spread across Europe between the 8th and 13th centuries. They contributed bitterness that balanced malt sweetness, but their greatest advantage was preservation. Beer brewed with hops remained drinkable far longer than earlier varieties, making long-distance transport commercially viable. This changed everything. A drink once consumed close to where it was brewed could now survive weeks or even months in barrels. Brewing expanded beyond villages and monasteries into regional and international commerce. Northern European cities flourished as brewing hubs. The Hanseatic League connected ports across the Baltic and North Seas, distributing hopped beer throughout Northern Europe. Cities such as Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck exported vast quantities to neighboring kingdoms, transforming brewing into one of medieval Europe's most profitable industries. Beer soon traveled beyond Europe altogether. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and later French ships crossed oceans carrying familiar provisions. Fresh water spoiled quickly aboard wooden vessels. Beer, with its lower alcohol content and relative stability, often became part of sailors' daily rations during long voyages. As European empires established colonies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they brought brewing traditions with them. Colonists planted barley where climates allowed, imported malt when necessary, and founded breweries that supplied growing settlements. Taverns emerged wherever ports developed, serving as places of commerce, politics, and community life. Beer had crossed oceans, but did not travel alone. It followed armies, merchants, missionaries, and imperial administrators, becoming woven into the machinery of expanding empires. Every barrel represented not merely a beverage, but a network of farms, mills, coopers, merchants, tax collectors, and governments. What looked like an ordinary drink had become global infrastructure. Its growing popularity also attracted something every successful commodity eventually encounters: control. Rulers quickly realized that beer could generate enormous revenue. Because it was consumed by nearly every social class, it became an ideal target for taxation. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, governments imposed duties on barley, malt, brewing equipment, taverns, and finished beer. Entire systems of taxation evolved around a single beverage, helping finance roads, armies, royal courts, and expanding bureaucracies. Brewing rights themselves became valuable privileges. In many cities, guilds tightly controlled who could legally produce beer, enforcing quality standards while limiting competition. Membership offered wealth and influence. Exclusion often meant economic failure. Beer was no longer simply brewed. It was regulated. The grain used to make beer also became a political issue. During years of poor harvests, governments faced impossible decisions. Should precious barley become bread for hungry populations, or beer that generated tax revenue and supported urban economies? Food shortages frequently transformed brewing into a matter of state policy. As European colonial empires expanded across the globe, brewing became intertwined with imperial agriculture. Colonists introduced commercial breweries while reshaping local farming systems to supply familiar ingredients. In many regions, land once devoted to traditional crops shifted toward grain production that served colonial markets. Beer itself was rarely the primary reason for conquest, but it benefited from the same imperial systems that transported sugar, grain, timber, spices, and manufactured goods across oceans. Behind every barrel stood an immense chain of labor. Farmers cultivated barley through uncertain seasons. Maltsters carefully germinated and dried the grain. Millers crushed it into usable malt. Coopers shaped wooden barrels by hand. Carters hauled heavy loads across muddy roads. Dockworkers loaded cargo onto ships. Sailors risked storms and disease to carry it across seas. Tavern keepers finally served the finished drink to growing urban populations. A single mug represented the work of countless people. By the 18th century, Europe was changing once again. Cities expanded rapidly as factories drew workers from the countryside. Beer became the everyday drink of millions of laborers. Weak small beer, containing relatively little alcohol, was inexpensive, filling, and often safer than untreated water. For many working families, it supplied both calories and hydration during long days of physical labor. Factory owners frequently tolerated moderate beer consumption during breaks, believing it helped sustain productivity while reducing illness caused by contaminated water supplies. Yet industrial growth created new inequalities. Large commercial breweries, backed by greater capital and improved equipment, steadily absorbed or outcompete smaller local brewers. Wealth became increasingly concentrated in fewer hands, while brewing evolved from a local craft into a highly organized business. The same drink that nourished workers also generated immense fortunes for merchants, landlords, financiers, and governments. Beer reflected the changing structure of society itself. It had become a product shaped not only by grain and yeast, but by economics, law, and power. And then, during the Industrial Revolution, science would transform brewing forever. For thousands of years, brewing depended on experience more than explanation. Master brewers relied on observation, inherited knowledge, and instinct. They could judge the temperature of a mash by touch, recognize healthy fermentation by smell, and predict a successful batch through years of practice. Yet they never truly understood why the process worked. A sudden change in weather, an invisible contaminant, or a poorly cleaned vessel could ruin an entire brew without warning. Fermentation remained one of history's greatest mysteries. Then science began to reveal its secrets. The 18th and 19th centuries transformed brewing more dramatically than any period before them. As the Industrial Revolution spread across Europe, nearly every stage of beer production changed. Steam engines powered mills that crushed grain faster than human labor ever could. Mechanical pumps moved enormous volumes of liquid through expanding breweries. Iron kettles replaced many wooden vessels, allowing greater control over heat and larger production sizes. What had once been the work of small workshops became the business of factories. Precision entered the brewhouse. The invention of the thermometer allowed brewers to monitor mash temperatures with unprecedented accuracy. Soon afterward, the hydrometer gave them a reliable way to measure the sugar content of wort and estimate the final alcohol content of each batch. For the first time, brewing became measurable. Consistency was no longer a matter of luck. It became a competitive advantage. Railroads accelerated the transformation even further. Before the 19th century, breweries typically served nearby towns because transporting heavy barrels over long distances was expensive and slow. Rail networks connected cities across entire countries, allowing breweries to distribute fresh beer hundreds of miles away in only a few days. Local breweries became regional businesses. Regional businesses became national brands. At almost the same moment, another revolution unfolded inside the laboratory. In the 1850s and 1860s, French scientist Louis Pasteur began studying fermentation. His research demonstrated that the process was driven not by mysterious chemical reactions, but by living microorganisms, yeast. The discovery changed brewing forever. For centuries, spoiled beer had been accepted as an unavoidable risk. Now brewers understood why it happened. Contamination could be prevented. Equipment could be sanitized. Fermentation could be controlled. Pasteur's work helped transform brewing from an ancient craft into an applied science, laying the foundation for modern microbiology and food safety. Another breakthrough soon followed. Mechanical refrigeration freed breweries from the limits of the seasons. Previously, many styles of beer could only be brewed reliably during the colder months of the year, when fermentation temperatures remained stable. Refrigeration made year-round brewing possible and opened the door to the widespread production of crisp, clean lagers. These pale lagers rapidly spread across Europe before reaching North and South America, where they would eventually dominate international markets. Packaging evolved alongside production. Glass bottles became stronger and more affordable. The invention of the metal crown cap in 1892 created a reliable seal that protected beer from contamination while extending its shelf life. Pasteurization further stabilized the product, allowing breweries to ship beer across continents with consistent quality. For the first time in history, someone could drink nearly identical beer whether they lived in Munich, London, New York, or Buenos Aires. Industrial brewing had erased distance. By the end of the 19th century, enormous brick breweries towered above growing cities. Some employed thousands of workers. Others produced millions of liters every year. Their smokestacks became symbols of industrial prosperity, while their products reached markets that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Beer had entered the age of machines, and it would never return to what it had been. If you're enjoying uncovering the hidden history behind everyday things, consider subscribing. Stories like this reveal that the objects we take for granted often carry the greatest influence on human history. The 20th century introduced another transformation, not in how beer was brewed, but in who controlled it. At the beginning of the century, thousands of independent breweries still operated across Europe and North America. Many served only their local communities, producing distinctive regional styles that reflected local ingredients and traditions. Then politics intervened. In the United States, the temperance movement gained extraordinary momentum. Reformers argued that alcohol contributed to poverty, domestic violence, crime, and declining public morality. Their campaign culminated in one of the most ambitious social experiments in modern history. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act brought prohibition into effect, outlawing the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the United States. The impact was immediate. Hundreds of breweries closed their doors. Some attempted to survive by producing soft drinks, malt syrup, cheese, candy, or ice cream. Others manufactured near beer, containing almost no alcohol. Many family businesses that had operated for generations disappeared forever. Yet prohibition failed to eliminate drinking. Instead, illegal breweries emerged across the country. Smugglers transported alcohol through secret routes. Hidden bars known as speakeasies multiplied in major cities. Organized crime syndicates built vast fortunes supplying an underground market that official law could not suppress. Rather than ending alcohol consumption, Prohibition transformed it into one of the largest illegal industries in American history. When the policy was repealed in 1933, the brewing landscape had changed beyond recognition. The companies that survived emerged larger, stronger, and better positioned to dominate the market. Small breweries had largely vanished. Industrial giants remained. Meanwhile, Europe faced two devastating world wars. Breweries struggled through grain shortages, rationing, bomb damage, fuel restrictions, and labor shortages as millions of workers joined military service. Governments redirected agricultural production toward feeding soldiers and civilians, leaving less grain available for brewing. Even so, beer rarely disappeared completely. Officials often regarded it as economically important, culturally significant, and, in some cases, essential for maintaining public morale. Once peace returned after 1945, brewing entered an era unlike anything before. Economic recovery, refrigeration, television, supermarkets, and global shipping transformed beer into one of the world's first truly international consumer products. Breweries no longer competed only through taste. They competed through image. Advertising agencies associated beer with friendship, celebration, sporting events, adventure, relaxation, and national identity. A bottle no longer represented only fermented grain. It represented a lifestyle. Brands became household names across continents. Corporate mergers accelerated throughout the second half of the 20th century. Regional breweries merged into national companies. National companies acquired international competitors. By the early 21st century, only a handful of multinational corporations controlled an enormous share of the global beer industry. Their supply chains stretched around the planet. Barley grown in one country could be malted in another, brewed somewhere else, packaged elsewhere, and finally consumed thousands of miles from where the grain had first been harvested. Beer had become truly global. Yet history has a way of moving in cycles. Just as brewing seemed destined to become the exclusive domain of multinational corporations, a quiet rebellion began. In the late 20th century, small independent brewers started challenging the idea that beer should taste the same everywhere. Inspired by forgotten recipes, regional traditions, and centuries-old techniques, they reopened neighborhood breweries and experimented with ingredients that industrial production had largely abandoned. This movement became known as the craft beer revolution. Instead of pursuing scale, craft brewers pursued character. They revived traditional styles that had nearly disappeared, rediscovered local grains and hops, aged beer in oak barrels, and embraced slower, more deliberate methods of production. Consumers, increasingly interested in authenticity and local identity, responded enthusiastically. For many communities, the brewery once again became more than a factory. It became a gathering place, a place where history, craftsmanship, and conversation met over a shared drink. Ironically, the newest chapter in brewing was also one of its oldest. After centuries of industrial expansion, beer was returning to its roots, not as a mass-produced commodity alone, but as a reflection of local culture and individual creativity. At the same time, the modern world began asking more difficult questions about alcohol itself. Medical research continued to deepen our understanding of the effects of excessive alcohol consumption. Studies linked heavy drinking to liver disease, cardiovascular problems, certain cancers, addiction, and countless preventable deaths each year. Governments responded with stricter regulations, public awareness campaigns, age restrictions, warning labels, advertising limits, and taxation policies intended to reduce alcohol-related harm. Beer had become both a cultural treasure and a public health challenge. That contradiction remains unresolved. For some, it represents celebration, craftsmanship, hospitality, and tradition. For others, it serves as a reminder of the responsibilities that accompany alcohol consumption. Like many of humanity's oldest inventions, its legacy is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. It reflects the societies that created it. Today, beer is brewed in nearly every country on Earth. From tiny mountain villages preserving recipes handed down through generations to highly automated facilities capable of producing millions of liters every week, brewing continues to unite ancient knowledge with modern technology. Yet every glass carries echoes of a much older story. It remembers the first farmers who cultivated wild barley in the Fertile Crescent. It remembers forgotten villages where fermentation first transformed soaked grain into something entirely unexpected. It remembers Sumerian scribes pressing wage records into wet clay while carefully recording daily beer rations. It remembers Egyptian workers pausing beneath the desert sun, drinking bread and beer that sustained the construction of monumental architecture. It remembers monks tending monastery breweries through long winters, preserving brewing knowledge during uncertain centuries. It remembers merchants loading barrels onto ships bound for distant ports, carrying not only beer but ideas, technology, and culture across continents. It remembers scientists standing in quiet laboratories, discovering that invisible organisms shaped one of humanity's oldest drinks. It remembers factory workers, railway engineers, coopers, farmers, maltsters, glassmakers, truck drivers, dock workers, retailers, and millions of ordinary people whose labor has kept brewing alive for thousands of years. Beer has always been more than a beverage. is a story about agriculture, a story about science, a story about religion, a story about labor, a story about trade, a story about empire, a story about industry, and ultimately, a story about civilization itself. The history of beer reveals something larger than beer. The ordinary objects surrounding us are often the products of extraordinary journeys. Behind the simplest items on a supermarket shelf lie thousands of years of experimentation, migration, conflict, cooperation, innovation, and human ambition. What appears ordinary is often anything, but beer did not simply accompany civilization as it developed. It helped sustain the first cities. It rewarded workers before money existed. It strengthened temples and kingdoms. It financed governments through taxation. It crossed oceans with explorers. It benefited from expanding empires. It inspired scientific breakthroughs that changed food production forever. It became one of the first truly global consumer products. And after nearly 10,000 years, it still occupies tables, celebrations, festivals, restaurants, homes, and cultures across the world. Few everyday objects can claim a history so long. Fewer still have shaped humanity so quietly. The next time a glass of beer is poured, it is worth remembering that its story began long before modern breweries, before industrial machines, before written language itself. It began with grain, with water, with wild yeast carried silently through the air, and with human curiosity. From those humble beginnings emerged a drink that nourished workers, inspired ritual, fueled commerce, advanced science, connected continents, and quietly helped shape the course of civilization. It was never just beer. It was one of history's most influential inventions, disguised as an everyday drink. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden history of beer, consider subscribing for more documentaries uncovering the extraordinary stories behind the foods, drinks, and everyday objects we often take for granted. And before you go, leave a comment below. What part of beer's history surprised you the most? And what ordinary thing should we uncover next?